Imagine, for just a minute, a scenario. Like, just humor me here. Someone breaks into your family home.
Okay, not a great start to the day.
Right, but I don't mean a house you just bought. I mean the house where you grew up, where your parents grew up, your grandparents, tracing back for
Oh,
generations.
wow. Okay, so deep roots.
Exactly. So this intruder comes in, they physically lock you out of the house, and they tack this very official, very legally dense piece of paper to the front door.
Like an eviction notice, basically.
Kinda, yeah. But this document claims that because they, quote unquote, discovered this house, because they walked up the driveway and saw it, it is now legally, comprehensively theirs.
That is a bold strategy.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, a highly effective one, historically speaking.
Yeah. So you're locked out. Now let's fast forward a few decades. You are still standing on the sidewalk. You've been trying to get the keys back this entire time.
Obviously.
But the situation has fundamentally escalated. You aren't just trying to get your house back because it belongs to your family anymore.
Right, there's a new urgency.
Yeah, you are desperately trying to break back inside because you can see through the windows that the new occupants have completely forgotten how to manage the electrical grid.
Oh, man.
The furnace is running at maximum capacity. The basement is entirely flooded. There are literally sparks flying from the outlets. And you are trying to intervene to save the entire neighborhood from burning to the ground.
That is an incredibly vivid framing. And honestly, if we are looking at the realities of global land management and climate resilience right now, it really isn't an exaggeration.
No, it's not.
It captures the dual nature of what we are examining today, which is, a profound historical injustice layered directly on top of an urgent, present-day existential crisis.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we have a towering stack of evidence sitting on the table between us.
We really do. It's massive.
We are talking about centuries of historical documents, foundational legal rulings that literally built the modern property market, investigative journalism, massive scientific reports on biodiversity, and cutting-edge debates on global conservation.
Right. And we are unpacking the incredibly multifaceted movement for indigenous land sovereignty.
Exactly. We're looking at the actual mechanical history of how land was separated from its original stewards. But maybe more importantly, we are looking at the physical reality of today.
Yeah, how returning land, which is a movement widely recognized as land back and empowering indigenous environmental stewardship, is rapidly becoming one of the most critical data-backed solutions for global climate resilience.
We aren't just doing a history lesson here. We are talking about the survival of the neighborhood.
And to really understand the architecture of this movement, we have to look at a staggering scope of human history. I mean, the materials we are synthesizing today span multiple continents and hundreds of years.
It's a huge timeline.
It is. We're going to look at 15th century religious doctrines that literally overwrote the rules of reality, 17th century diplomatic agreements that are still active today, and monumental landscape-altering legal battles like the Mabo decision in Australia and the Bolt decision in the United States.
And we are going to get into the deep weeds of modern science, too.
Oh, absolutely.
We're looking at the physics of cultural burning, satellite data coming out of the Amazon, and emerging highly controversial battlegrounds over artificial intelligence and the deep ocean.
It's a lot of ground to cover.
It is. Now, before we really get into the machinery of all this, I want to establish a ground rule for you, the listener. We are looking at a massive stack of evidence today, and this material covers centuries of intense, often brutal political, legal, and physical conflict between nation-states and indigenous peoples.
Right, and there are very strong opinions on all sides of these historical events.
Exactly. So our job today isn't to take a political side or tell you who to root for. Our mission is to impartially report and synthesize the raw data, the legal logic, and the lived experiences documented in these texts.
Yeah, we want to act as your guide so you can clearly see the underlying architecture of this global movement for yourself.
Because you really cannot understand the modern push to reclaim land, and you certainly cannot understand the current climate science regarding conservation, without first understanding exactly how the land was legally and philosophically stripped from indigenous peoples in the first place.
You have to understand the systems that were erased and the highly specific legal fictions that were engineered to replace them.
So let's start right there. How did the intruder legally justify taking the house? Like, how do you legalize theft on a continental scale?
Well, you do it by inventing a new category of reality. It starts with a framework known as the doctrine of discovery.
Okay.
And this is intimately tied to a Latin legal concept called terra nullius, These are 15th century Christian European concepts, originating largely from papal bulls, which are decrees from the Pope.
Right, so very high authority back then.
The highest. When European empires began expanding globally, they faced a massive logistical and theological problem.
Which was what?
Well, how do you claim legal ownership of vast territories that are already occupied by millions of highly organized people?
Yeah, you can't just say, I want it, therefore it's mine, if you want to maintain the illusion of an ordered, civilized legal system back home in Europe.
Exactly. You need a legal loophole. So they engineered one. The doctrine of discovery essentially stated that Christian European nations gained immediate, overriding legal title to any lands they discovered that were not already ruled by a Christian monarch.
Wait, just by planting a flag?
Just by laying eyes on it, or even just mapping the coastline.
That is wild.
And the concept of terra nullius, which literally translates to nobody's land, was the mechanism that made this possible. The legal argument was that because indigenous peoples did not use the land in a way that European agricultural and property systems recognized, the land was, legally speaking, empty.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. Because this is wild. It's like a game of Monopoly, but one player suddenly invents a rule that says, look, I know you're currently standing on this property, but because you haven't built a little green plastic house on it exactly the way I build my little green plastic houses, your ownership doesn't exist.
That's a really good way to visualize it.
The square is empty and therefore I can buy it. I mean, it's not just stealing, it's defining the victim out of existence.
That is a very apt way to describe the legal psychology of the era. And what is absolutely crucial for our listeners to understand is that this wasn't just some archaic philosophy used by guys in pantaloons getting off wooden ships.
Right, this stuck around.
Oh, it did more than stick around.
Mm.
These exact doctrines were hard-coded into the foundational property law of modern contemporary nations.
Oh.
We really have to talk about the 1823 United States Supreme Court case, Johnson v. Emmentosh.
Okay, this is the case that essentially built the American real estate market.
But it is the absolute bedrock of American property law. So the case involved two white men who were arguing over who owned a specific parcel of land in Illinois.
Okay.
One guy had bought the land directly from the Piankashaw Native American nation. The other guy had bought the exact same land later from the United States federal government.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right? So the Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice John Marshall, had to decide who has the valid deed. Does a native nation have the right to sell its own land?
And Marshall's logic here is staggering. He essentially realizes that if he rules that native nations have absolute sovereign ownership of their land, it would invalidate almost every land grant given to the European colonists.
Including the land grants given to the veterans of the Revolutionary War.
Wow. So it would crash the entire American economy.
Precisely. Marshall was terrified of the economic fallout. So to protect the American real estate market, he leans directly on the doctrine of discovery.
He actually cites it.
He does. He writes into American law that upon discovery, the European powers and subsequently the United States gained the ultimate underlying title to the land.
Okay.
He rules that Native Americans do not hold absolute title. They hold a diminished status. He called it a mere right of occupancy.
A right of occupancy. So, returning to our house analogy from the start, it's like saying you can live in the house, you can sleep in the bedrooms, but you don't hold the deed. The bank, which in this case is the federal government, holds the real title. And because they hold the title, they can eventually decide to terminate your lease.
Yes. And once that legal framework of diminished ownership was locked into the common law, it just greased the wheels for the massive structural erasure that followed.
Because it wasn't just legal theory anymore.
Exactly. It became bureaucratic machinery. The documents outline the progression perfectly. First, you have the physical violent removals. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 in the United States, signed by Andrew Jackson.
Yeah, the Trail of Tears.
Right. This authorized the forced military relocation of entire native nations like the Cherokee, Choctaw, Muskogee, Chickasaw, and Seminole from their ancestral homelands in the southeast, pushing them west to the Mississippi River.
And let's be very clear about the economic motivation there. It wasn't just about moving people to get them out of the way. It was about clearing millions of acres of highly fertile land to massively expand the plantation economy and the cotton industry.
Oh, 100%. It was a brutal economic calculation. But the documents also highlight a different perhaps even more insidious form of structural erasure that happened a bit later. Let's look at the mechanics of the Dawes Act of 1887.
Also known as the General Allotment Act, right?
Yes.
Because once the tribes were pushed onto reservations, the government realized, wait, they still hold these reservations communally? So the Dawes Act was designed to destroy the concept of collective indigenous landholding. But how did it actually work mechanically? Like, how did they use paperwork to take the land?
The mechanics are devastatingly simple. Imagine a native nation holds 100,000 acres in common. No one person owns a specific square. The community stewards the whole territory together.
Right.
The federal government comes in and says, we are going to modernize you. We are going to assimilate you into civilized society by making you individual private property owners.
So government surveyors draw a grid over the reservation. They assign 160 acres to the head of a family, 80 acres to a single person. And on the surface, someone might hear that and think, well, they are giving them land. That sounds okay. But that wasn't what was happening at all.
Not at all. First, there's a huge catch. The government doesn't just hand over the deed. They hold the land in trust for 25 years.
Why?
Well, during that time, the government can unilaterally decide if a native person is competent to manage their own affairs. And they often used incredibly racist metrics like blood quantum, measuring how much white blood they supposedly had.
That is just awful.
It gets worse. If deemed incompetent, the government could lease or sell the land out from under them. Second, suddenly these individual plots are subject to state property taxes.
Oh, which is a brilliant, evil trap. You take people who operate on a communal subsistence economy, right? They hunt, they gather, they farm collectively. They don't operate on a cash basis.
Exactly.
And you suddenly hand them a tax bill for a private plot of land. When they inevitably can't pay the cash tax, the local sheriff puts the land up for a tax auction, and white settlers swoop in and buy it for pennies.
That is exactly how it functioned. And the final, most destructive mechanism of the Dawes Act was the concept of surplus land.
Surplus? How can land be surplus?
Well, once the government had assigned these individual allotments to every tribal member, whatever land was left over within the original reservation boundaries was declared surplus and opened up for white settlement and corporate purchase.
Wow.
Yeah, it essentially checkerboarded the reservations, it destroyed the contiguous land base, shattered the communal economy, and legally transferred over 90 million acres out of indigenous hands in just a few decades.
90 million acres, that's just hard to even comprehend. And we see these exact same bureaucratic mechanisms being deployed globally, too. The documents highlight the massive confiscations of Maori land in Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Yes, a very similar playbook.
Tracking from 1860 onward, the British Crown used a combination of outright war, punitive confiscations for tribes deemed in rebellion, and then, crucially, the Native Land Court.
Right. The Native Land Court operated almost identically to the Dawes Act. Its explicit, documented goal was to transform communal Maori land title into individualized title.
Again, destroying the collective.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It forced Maori leaders into expensive, prolonged legal battles in European-style courts just to prove they owned their land. And the legal fees alone often forced them to sell the land they were trying to protect. The system was engineered to result in dispossession.
But the sources we are looking at make a very distinct, very important point here. They emphasize that we cannot view this simply as a story of European legal domination rolling over an empty legal landscape.
That's a critical point.
Long before these colonial ships arrived and during this entire process of expansion, indigenous peoples had highly sophisticated, incredibly complex diplomatic and legal paradigms of their own. They weren't just living randomly on the land, they were governing it.
Yes. And the contrast between the European paradigm and the indigenous paradigms is really profound. Colonial law was built on extraction, exclusive private property, and dominion over nature. Indigenous legal and diplomatic systems, conversely, prioritize mutual obligation, deep relationality, and ecological restraint.
Right.
A brilliant example detailed in the research is the dish with one spoon treaty tradition.
I found this concept completely fascinating when I was reading the sources. This was utilized by the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and several other nations in the Great Lakes and northeastern regions of North America, right?
It is an absolute masterclass in sustainable diplomacy. So the dish represents a specific hunting ground or territory and all the resources within it.
Okay.
The one spoon signifies that all the different nations sharing that territory must eat from the same dish, meaning they acknowledge a shared reliance on the exact same ecosystem. But the treaty isn't just a metaphor. It comes with strict legal obligations.
Right, like you only take what you need for your community. You must always leave something in the dish for others, which explicitly includes the animals and future generations.
Yes.
And you keep the dish clean. You don't poison the well.
What strikes me about this is that the land itself is treated as a treaty partner. It isn't a commodity to be surveyed, chopped into 160-acre blocks, and depleted. It is an entity requiring respect. And when European diplomats first arrived, indigenous nations attempted to extend these frameworks of mutual respect to them. The documents point to the Turo Wampum, or the Gazwania, from 1613.
Oh, I loved reading about this.
It's incredible. This was an agreement forged between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch. It wasn't written on parchment, it was recorded into a belt of wampum beads.
The physical object is the law. The belt has a background of white beads, and running down the length of it are two dark purple rows, completely parallel, never intersecting.
The visual symbolism dictates the legal relationship.
Okay.
The two rows represent two vessels traveling down the same river of life. One vessel is the indigenous canoe, which carries their laws, their customs, their spirituality, and their sovereignty.
Okay.
The other vessel is the European ship, carrying their distinct laws and customs. The agreement encoded in the beads is that they will share the river. They will travel side by side in peace, friendship, and commerce. But, and this is the critical clause, neither side will attempt to steer the other's vessel.
It is a framework for parallel, non-interfering coexistence. It is the absolute antithesis of the doctrine of discovery.
It really is.
The Turo Wampum says, we see you, we respect your right to exist, let's trade, but keep your hands off our steering paddle. The doctrine of discovery says, we see you, but legally you don't exist, so we're taking both boats and the river.
And when those European empires decided they were not content to just share the river, when the physical and legal dispossession accelerated, the resistance was immediate, highly organized, and ferocious. The historical texts make it abundantly clear that indigenous peoples never simply surrendered.
No, the timeline of colonization is matched year for year by a timeline of fierce resistance. In 1680, you have the Pueblo Revolt in what is now New Mexico.
A huge moment.
Yeah. The Spanish colonial rulers had imposed forced labor systems, known as encomiendas, and were brutally suppressing Pueblo religion. The Pueblo communities managed to orchestrate a highly coordinated, synchronized uprising across dozens of scattered villages, completely overthrowing Spanish rule and driving them out of the territory for over a decade, restoring their own governance and land control.
We see the exact same scale of resistance in the Andes. In 1780, Tupac Amaru II, who was a descendant of the last Inca ruler, he led a massive, widespread rebellion against the Spanish Empire.
Wow.
Yeah, specifically targeting the brutal forced labor systems in the silver mines and the crushing colonial taxation.
And the Mapuche people in Chile. I had no idea about the scale of the Arauco War. The documents describe how the Mapuche fought the Spanish Empire, and later the Chilean state, for literally centuries.
It's incredible endurance.
They developed advanced cavalry tactics, adapted to Spanish warfare, and actually forced the Spanish crown to sign treaties recognizing Mapuche autonomy and establishing a heavily militarized border. They defended their sovereignty militarily against a global superpower.
And it is vital to note that resistance wasn't solely defined by armed conflict either. The documents detail extraordinary movements of strategic, nonviolent, direct action. A key example is the settlement of Parihaka in Taranaki, New Zealand, in the 1880s.
Right.
This community was led by two Maori prophets, the Tiwiti Orangomai and Tohu Kakahi. Parihaka became the epicenter of a massive peaceful resistance campaign against the creeping confiscation of Maori land.
They used incredibly modern tactics. Decades before Gandhi or the American Civil Rights Movement, the people of Parihaka were engaging in sustained, nonviolent civil disobedience.
They really were.
They went out and deliberately plowed land that had been confiscated by the government, planting crops to assert their continuous, unbroken ownership. When the government arrested the plowmen, the community just sent out more. They overwhelmed the colonial jail system with peaceful protesters.
They were systematically disrupting the machinery of colonization using moral and physical presence.
But this brings us to a really difficult transition in the history, because despite the brilliance of Parihaka, the New Zealand government eventually sent in armed troops, invaded the settlement, arrested the leaders, and dismantled the town.
Yeah, the physical resistance kept the communities alive, it preserved their cultures, but eventually the colonial states consolidated their military and bureaucratic power. The frontier essentially closed.
So if you are an indigenous nation in the 20th century, how do you fight? If you can't fight on the battlefield anymore, you were forced to fight in the courtroom. But, as we've established, the colonizers' legal system, going all the way back to Johnson v. Emmentosh, literally wrote the rules specifically to exclude you.
That is the ultimate paradox of indigenous legal history. How do you seek justice in a court that views your existence as a legal fiction?
Right.
And the answer, as we see in the transition from the 19th to the 20th century, is that it requires generations of relentless strategic pressure. You have to learn the colonizers' law better than they know it themselves.
You have to beat them at their own game.
Exactly. The only way to fight a rigged legal system is to patiently dismantle its foundational myths from the inside, forcing the courts to confront their own logical contradictions until the system just breaks.
And that is exactly what happened. The resistance didn't end, it just put on a suit and went to law school. The 20th century saw these movements turn the colonizers' own legal tools, treaties, contracts, property law, into weapons for land recovery. And the most spectacular example of this, the moment where the foundational myth truly shattered, happened in Australia in 1992.
The Mabo decision. You really cannot overstate the monumental nature of this case in global legal history. It revolves around Eddie Koiki Mabo and the Miriam people of the Murray Islands in the Torres Strait.
Right.
They spent over a decade fighting a grueling battle through the Australian legal system.
And the backdrop to this case is almost unbelievable. Up until 1992, the formal, binding legal stance of the entire Australian nation was still based on that 15th century concept of terra nullius.
Yes.
The Australian government legally maintained that before the British arrived in 1788, the entire continent was empty land, legally devoid of owners.
Which is an objective absurdity. I mean, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have continuously inhabited, managed, and governed the continent for tens of thousands of years.
Right.
They have the oldest continuous cultures on the entire planet.
Right.
But the Australian legal system simply closed its eyes and plugged its ears, insisting the land was empty.
So how did Eddie Mabo break that logic?
By meticulously proving a continuous, deeply regulated system of land ownership that the courts just could not ignore. The Miriam people presented overwhelming evidence of their traditional laws, their complex systems of inheriting specific garden plots, and their mechanisms for resolving border disputes.
They showed the receipts.
They absolutely did. And the High Court of Australia was finally backed into a corner. They had to look at this modern democratic nation and admit that its foundational property law was based on a racist medieval fiction.
So they overturned it.
In a landmark ruling, the High Court formally struck down the doctrine of terra nullius. They recognized that the Miriam people owned their land prior to British annexation, and this is the crucial legal pivot, that this native title survived the acquisition of British sovereignty.
Wow.
It forced the entire Australian legal system to acknowledge pre-existing Indigenous land rights, fundamentally altering the landscape of property law in the country.
And while the myth of the empty land was falling in Australia, we see a parallel seismic shift happening in North America regarding how courts interpret history and treaties. I want to look at the 1974 Bolt decision in the United States. The official case name is United States v. Washington. Let me set the scene for this because it's intense.
The fish wars.
Exactly. For decades in the Pacific Northwest, tribal members from nations like the Nisqually and Puyallup were being routinely harassed, beaten, and arrested by Washington state game wardens for fishing in the rivers.
And the state claimed they were doing this to conserve the salmon.
Right. But the tribes had treaties from the 1850s, signed with the federal government, that explicitly guaranteed their right of taking fish at all usual and accustomed grounds and stations, in common with all citizens of the territory.
And for over a century, the state of Washington essentially ignored that treaty language, arguing that in common with just meant the tribes had to follow the exact same state regulations as white sport fishermen.
Right. But then the case gets to federal judge George Bolt. And Bolt does something revolutionary. He decides to look at the linguistics. He rules that the treaty cannot be interpreted using modern legal definitions.
Okay.
It must be interpreted exactly as the native signers, who were relying on interpreters speaking a trade jargon called Chinook jargon, would have understood it in 1854. And he looks at the phrase "in common with" and says, logically, if you hold something in common with someone else, you split it.
50-50.
Exactly. Bolt drops a legal bomb. He rules that the treaties guarantee the tribes the right to harvest up to 50% of the harvestable fish returning to those waters.
That's huge.
But he didn't just give them a quota. The truly transformative part of the Bolt decision is that he legally affirmed the tribes as co-managers of the state's fisheries.
That is the turning point. They weren't just granted access as a minority group. They were granted authority as sovereign nations. They became legal stewards of the resource alongside the state government, determining conservation policy, managing hatcheries, and enforcing regulations.
And speaking of forcing the courts to interpret history differently, Canada had an absolute breakthrough in 1997 with the Delgamuukw decision. This case fundamentally changed what constitutes evidence in a Western courtroom.
Yes, this case involved the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en nations in British Columbia. They were suing the provincial government to assert ownership and jurisdiction over 58,000 square kilometers of their ancestral territory.
Okay.
Now, in a Western property dispute, you usually present a paper deed. But the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en rely on an incredibly complex, rigorously maintained system of oral history known as the Adak and the Kungaks.
And we should clarify for the listener, this isn't just someone telling a casual story around a campfire.
Not at all. The Adak are the sacred, memorized histories of specific territories, lineages, and laws. They are publicly recited, witnessed, and validated during massive formal gatherings called feasts.
So it's formal.
Very formal. The feast hall operates essentially as their constitutional court. If an elder recites an Adak and gets a boundary or a lineage wrong, the other chiefs present will correct them. It is a peer-reviewed, strictly governed historical record.
So the Indigenous nations take this oral history to the lower courts in Canada, and the initial trial judge basically scoffs at it. He dismisses their entire system of memory and law as mere mythology and hearsay, and he rules against them. But they appeal it all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada.
And the Supreme Court issues a devastating rebuke to the lower court. They rule that the trial judge made a fundamental error by applying a deeply ethnocentric Western bias against oral history.
Wow.
Yeah, the Supreme Court declared that Aboriginal oral history must be accommodated and must be given equal independent weight to written colonial documents as legitimate legal proof of Aboriginal title.
That is a staggering conceptual shift. To have the highest court in a G7 nation explicitly states that a Gitxsan elder recounting a memorized lineage holds the exact same legal weight, the same evidentiary value, as a piece of parchment signed by a British king.
It radically expanded the legal universe.
Yeah.
It meant Indigenous nations no longer had to contort their existence to fit into the colonizers' narrow definition of paper trails.
Right.
And importantly, these legal precedents weren't limited to the English-speaking world. The documents take us to Latin America for a critical international breakthrough. In 2001, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights issued a ruling on the case of Awastingi v. Nicaragua.
This was the very first binding international tribunal to uphold collective Indigenous land rights, wasn't it?
It was a massive precedent. The government of Nicaragua had unilaterally granted a massive logging concession to a foreign timber company on the ancestral lands of the Mayanya community of Awastingi. The government didn't ask, they just sold the trees.
Classic.
So the community took the case to the international court, arguing that their human rights are being violated.
And the court agreed. They ruled that under the American Convention on Human Rights, the right to property includes the communal property of Indigenous peoples, even if they don't have a formal title deed from the state.
Exactly. The court recognized that their traditional tenure system was the title. The tribunal ordered the state of Nicaragua not only to cancel the logging concession, but to formally demarcate, delimit, and title the communal lands of Awastingi.
That's amazing.
And by extension, to create a legal mechanism to do this for all Indigenous communities in the country. It established a binding international standard that collective Indigenous land tenure is a protected human right.
And we see that precedent rippling out immediately. The materials mention the Sariacu victory against the state of Ecuador in 2012. The Inter-American Court ruled that Ecuador had violated the rights of the Quechua people of Sariacu by allowing an international oil company to bring explosives onto their territory for seismic testing without obtaining free, prior, and informed consent.
Right.
The court forced the state to apologize, pay damages, and physically remove the explosives from the jungle.
The legal architecture of dispossession, that fortress built by Johnson v. Armitage in the Dawes Act, was finally being disassembled piece by piece. And alongside these court victories, we also see crucial early political victories where the state actually relented. A shining example in the text is the return of Blue Lake to the Taos Pueblo in 1970.
This is a fascinating story, largely because it was signed into law by President Richard Nixon. The federal government had seized Blue Lake, which is located high in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains and is the absolute spiritual center, the holiest site for the Taos Pueblo.
Yeah.
They seized it in 1906 to create a national forest. The Pueblo fought relentlessly for over 60 years to get it back. The government repeatedly tried to just pay them off. They offered monetary compensation for the taking of the land.
The Indian Claims Commission was designed to do exactly that, basically extinguish the title by writing a check. But the Taos Pueblos steadfastly refused the money. For them, Blue Lake is the source of their life, their religion, their emergence as a people. A monetary payout is meaningless in a paradigm where the land is a relative, not a resource. They only wanted the land back.
And eventually they won. Nixon signed the bipartisan bill returning all 48,000 acres, including the lake, to the Pueblo in trust. And this signaled a massive tectonic shift in federal Indian policy, moving definitively away from the disastrous termination era, where the government tried to literally dissolve tribes and relocate people to urban centers, and moving toward an era of tribal self-determination.
But as we look at this string of victories, Mabo, Bolt, Belgamuku, Awastinyi, we have to confront a profound philosophical dilemma that runs through all of these documents.
Right. And I want to push back on the celebratory narrative just a bit here, because as I read these court cases, I couldn't shake this feeling of a fundamental, almost tragic tension. You have these brilliant lawyers and elders fighting in these Western courts, but they are being forced to translate their deeply sacred, ancestral, relational connections to the earth, the concepts we saw in the dish with one spoon. They are forced to translate that into the cold, clinical, Western legal definitions of fee simple property, title, and exclusive rights.
Yeah, the language changes.
When you have to argue that a sacred mountain is your real estate just to keep a mining company from blowing the top off it, doesn't something profound get lost in translation? Aren't they forced to legitimize the very legal system that colonized them in the first place?
That is the exact tension that Indigenous legal scholars and activists debate constantly. It is an incredibly sharp observation. You are highlighting the core limitation of relying solely on the colonizer's courts. Yes, something is always lost in translation. As scholars have pointed out, when you enter the courtroom, you are playing a game on a board that was designed by your opponent using rules they wrote. You are inherently limiting your arguments to what the state is willing to hear.
So why do it?
Because it is a necessary tactical warfare for survival. These legal victories are absolutely crucial. They stop the chainsaws, they stop the bulldozers, they secure the right to the land on paper, which provides a shield.
It's triage.
Exactly. But the documents make it clear that the legal victory is not the finish line. The true goal, the ultimate objective of sovereignty, isn't just holding a deed in a filing cabinet. It is about exercising stewardship on the land. It's about physical reconnection, breathing life back into the relationship with the territory.
And that transition from the legal theory of the courtroom to the dirt under the fingernails physical reality brings us perfectly to the modern era. The legal groundwork painstakingly laid in the 70s, 80s, and 90s has erupted into what we now globally recognize as the land back movement.
Land back is a rallying cry, but it is fundamentally a pragmatic material movement. It is resulting in historic, physical transfers of real estate and jurisdiction right now. The sources are full of recent massive land returns that are genuinely shifting the map of North America.
Let's look at exactly how this is happening because the mechanisms are fascinating. It's not just the government handing back national parks out of the goodness of their hearts. Often it's tribes using their own economic power to buy their land back on the open market. For example, the materials highlight the Washoe tribe in California. They recently purchased more than 10,000 acres of their ancestral land near Lake Tahoe, creating the Wellmelty Preserve.
That represents one of the largest tribal land returns in California history. And what is vital here is not just the acreage, but the intent. The Washoe tribe didn't buy this land to build a casino or a resort. They purchased it for conservation. They are utilizing traditional ecological knowledge to manage the sagebrush, juniper, and pine forest ecosystems. And crucially, they're using it as a space to bring their youth back out onto the land, to reconnect with their language and culture.
We see the same pattern with the Tola River Indian tribe, who successfully lobbied and worked with the federal government to regain 17,000 acres of ancestral land in California's southern Sierra Nevada, expanding their reservation boundaries. We see the Yurok tribe getting back vast tracts of their homelands in Northern California. And again, the immediate focus is ecological. Restoring salmon habitats, preparing the land for the reintroduction of cultural fire, and actively removing invasive species.
And we also have to recognize that the sheer size of the return isn't the only metric of success. The research details highly strategic acquisitions that, while small in acreage, are monumentally important culturally. Look at the Cheyenne River Youth Project. They are a native-led, grassroots nonprofit organization, and they recently purchased just 40 acres of land in South Dakota.
Right, 40 acres compared to 17,000 seems like a drop in the bucket. But you have to look at the geography. Where is that 40 acres? It is located adjacent to Bear Butte in the Black Hills, and Bear Butte is a profoundly sacred site for the Lakota, Cheyenne, and many other Plains nations. It is a place of pilgrimage, fasting, and intense ceremony.
Exactly. The geography dictates the value. For decades, the area around Bear Butte has been threatened by commercial development, particularly biker bars and campgrounds tied to the Sturgis motorcycle rally, which creates massive noise and disruption during sacred ceremony.
Oh, wow.
By purchasing those specific 40 acres, the Cheyenne River Youth Project created a physical buffer. They ensured that their community, and specifically their youth, have guaranteed safe, uninterrupted access to a sacred place for ceremony, safe from commercial encroachment.
It's a strategic beachhead of sovereignty. And on the other end of the spectrum, regarding massive structural shifts, the documents point to the Haida Nation's recent title agreement over Haida Gwaii in British Columbia.
This agreement is widely viewed by legal scholars as a new gold standard for negotiated recognition. To understand it, you have to know that the Haida Nation has been fighting for decades. In the 1980s, Haida elders were literally getting arrested standing on logging roads at Lyell Island to stop the clear-cutting of their ancient cedar forests.
Wow.
That physical resistance forced the government into co-management agreements, but the 2024 title agreement goes much further.
How does it differ from a regular treaty?
The provincial government of British Columbia fundamentally bypassed decades of grueling adversarial litigation in the courts. They simply passed legislation formally recognizing and affirming that the Haida Nation possesses underlying Aboriginal title to the entirety of the terrestrial area of Haida Gwaii, over 2 million acres.
That's incredible.
It shifts the burden. The Crown is no longer the presumed owner negotiating a handover. The Crown acknowledges the Haida have always been the owners. It provides a transition period to harmonize provincial laws with Haida jurisdiction, linking their stewardship directly to the future protection of the islands.
It's an incredible victory. But, as with everything in this deep dive, we have to look at the other side of the ledger. While we celebrate these physical returns, the sources also highlight the massive, ongoing, systemic barriers. The machinery of dispossession wasn't just turned off in 1890, it is still running. I want to dive into this incredible investigative report from GRIST that looks at the ongoing financial extraction from Indigenous lands.
The Trust Lands Investigation. If you want to understand the systemic economic inequality baked into the modern American state, this report is essential reading.
This completely blew my mind. So we all know the government took the land, but what did they do with it? The investigation revealed that 15 states in the U.S. currently hold millions of acres of trust lands, lands that were directly expropriated from tribal nations. But they don't just sit on this land. The federal government gave these lands to the states upon statehood, specifically to generate revenue for public institutions. So the states leased these stolen lands out to massive corporations for timber harvesting, fossil fuel extraction, mining, and industrial agriculture.
And where does that lease money go?
It goes directly into state endowments. That revenue, generated from extracted resources on stolen Indigenous land, is used to fund public universities, public K-12 schools, state hospitals, and even state penitentiaries.
It is the financial phantom of dispossession. The dispossession wasn't just a discrete historical event, it was the creation of a perpetual financial engine. The states are literally balancing their public budgets and subsidizing the education of non-native citizens through the continuous, legally sanctioned extraction of wealth from Indigenous lands. The wealth transfer never stopped.
Going back to our analogy from the beginning, it's exactly like the intruder taking your family home. You finally get them to admit in court that they stole it, but they look at you and say, yeah, we admit it was wrong, but we're going to keep renting the house out on Airbnb every weekend because we need the cash to pay for our kids' college tuition. It is a structural absurdity.
Which is why the land back movement is so multifaceted. It cannot just be about legal titles. It has to be about economic disentanglement and building independent community resilience. And we see this grassroots resilience happening in real time. The documents highlight incredible intentional communities like the Muskoka-led Ekavien Ufolek community in Alabama.
I found their approach so inspiring because it is so holistic. They're a group of indigenous people who pooled their resources to buy back a large tract of rural land in their traditional homelands, from which their ancestors were forcibly removed during the Trail of Tears. But they aren't just creating a private park, they are building an intentional eco-village.
Right, they're tying the physical reclamation of the land directly to the reclamation of their identity. The community is built around regenerative agriculture, shared governance, reviving traditional ecological knowledge, and crucially, language revitalization. It is an immersion environment for the Muskoka language. The article describing them actually uses a fantastic phrase. They are seeking to reverse gentrify rural areas.
They are buying back the hollowed out rural landscapes and injecting life, language, and sustainability back into them. It's a holistic approach to sovereignty. They aren't just protecting a forest, they're rebuilding an entire lifeway. And this brings us to a really critical pivot in our analysis. We've talked extensively about the history, the law, and the physical return of the land. But there is a massive scientific component to this.
The ecological imperative.
Right. Let's ask the most pragmatic question possible. What actually happens to the environment when the original stewards get the keys back to the house? If the ultimate goal is to save the neighborhood from burning down, if we are facing a global climate and biodiversity crisis, what does the hard data say about indigenous land management?
Well, the scientific data is unequivocal. This is no longer just a conversation about historical justice, though that obviously remains paramount. Land back is increasingly recognized by international scientists, ecologists, and global policymakers as one of the most vital, pragmatic, and effective solutions to the climate crisis.
Let's talk about fire. Because the neighborhood literally is burning down. In California and Australia, across the Mediterranean, we are seeing catastrophic, landscape-destroying megafires. The materials we're reviewing dive deep into the physics of fire and how indigenous fire practices are completely reshaping modern wildfire strategies.
To understand the current crisis, you have to understand the catastrophic failure of 20th century Western forest management. For over a century, federal agencies like the U.S. Forest Service operated on a strict policy of total fire suppression. The colonial mindset viewed all fire as a destructive threat that had to be aggressively eradicated by 10 a.m. the next day.
Right.
But they misunderstood the basic physics and ecology of the landscape. Environments like the California pine forests or the Brazilian savannas didn't just adapt to fire, they evolved requiring fire.
Right. So by suppressing every single fire for 100 years, what did the Forest Service actually do? They allowed massive, unnatural amounts of fuel, dead wood, dry underbrush, tightly packed saplings to accumulate on the forest floor. They turned the forests into tinder boxes. So now, when a fire sparks during a drought, it doesn't just burn the underbrush, it burns so hot and climbs the ladder fuel so fast that it crowns in the canopy and destroys everything, practically sterilizing the soil.
Exactly. It is a disaster of our own making. But indigenous peoples, like the Karuk, the Yurok, and the Hoopa Valley tribes in California, have always understood fire differently. They don't view fire as an enemy. They view it as a highly specific tool, a process, and even a medicine for the land. They practice what is called cultural burning.
Can you explain the mechanics of cultural burning? How does it prevent the megafires?
Cultural burns are intentional, highly regulated, low-intensity fires. They are carefully timed, usually in the cooler, wetter months, taking into account precise humidity, wind, and soil moisture conditions. The fire creeps along the ground. It clears out all that accumulated dead underbrush, the exact fuel that feeds the megafires.
Oh.
But it leaves the mature, thick-bark trees completely unharmed.
Okay, that makes sense.
Furthermore, the ash cycles vital nutrients rapidly back into the soil, and the cleared canopy allows sunlight to reach the forest floor, which stimulates the growth of specific culturally important plants, like hazel for basket weaving, and creates ideal grazing habitats for elk and deer.
They are essentially inoculating the forest against catastrophic fire while simultaneously farming the landscape. And the deeply ironic, tragic part of this history is that the state of California aggressively criminalized this practice. Indigenous elders were arrested for tending to their own forests.
Yes, cultural burning was outlawed and suppressed. But now, as the state faces billions of dollars in fire damage every year, state and federal agencies are desperately reversing course. They are coming to these tribes, asking to learn, attempting to remove the bureaucratic red tape to allow indigenous fire practitioners to lead controlled burns and manage the crisis. And we see this exact same realization happening globally.
The sources detail an amazing initiative in Brazil involving the Zarente people.
Yes, in the Cerrado region of Brazil, which is a massive, highly biodiverse savanna ecosystem currently threatened by worsening droughts and immense destructive wildfires. The Zarende indigenous fire brigades are combining their deeply rooted traditional knowledge of how fire moves through the savanna with modern technology. They're using satellite data and advanced mapping software to track climate anomalies, identify fuel loads, and strategically deploy their traditional preventative burns to protect the fragile ecosystem.
It is the perfect synthesis of ancient stewardship and modern analytical technology.
It really is. And the positive data on indigenous stewardship extends far beyond just fire management. The Mongabay reports included in our sources are absolutely fascinating. They conducted a massive analysis of data across the Amazon basin. What they found regarding carbon sequestration is mind-blowing.
What did they find?
The statistics are a stark indictment of state-led conservation. The researchers looked at satellite data and ground-level biomass measurements, and they found that indigenous lands and legally protected territories sequester practically all of the Amazon's carbon.
Wow.
The areas outside of these territories are often net carbon emitters due to deforestation, logging, and cattle ranching. Furthermore, the data clearly shows that indigenous lands hold the world's healthiest, most intact tropical forests, and they suffer from significantly lower rates of deforestation than even strictly protected national parks.
But there is a massive caveat in the data, right? It only works if the legal foundation is solid.
Exactly. The Mongabay research emphasizes that these incredible ecological benefits only hold true when indigenous land rights are legally secure, formally demarcated, and actually enforced against illegal incursions. If the state grants a title but allows illegal miners to invade with impunity, the forest still falls. Tenure security is the prerequisite for climate security.
Now, speaking of statistics and data, there's a very interesting Guardian article in the stack that offers a critical note of caution regarding how advocates talk about this data. It details how researchers recently debunked a very widely repeated statistic.
This is a crucial point regarding scientific integrity. For years, there has been a statistic circulating everywhere, the claim that indigenous peoples protect 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity.
I've heard that everywhere. I've seen it on protest signs. I've seen it in documentaries. I think I've even seen it in official UN press releases.
It became ubiquitous. It was repeated by major international NGOs and the global media. But when a team of researchers actually tried to trace that statistic back to its original scientific source, they found nothing.
Nothing at all.
No, there was no rigorous, peer-reviewed global data set that proved that specific number. It was essentially an extrapolated guess, perhaps based on a misreading of earlier reports that just got repeated so often it became treated as gospel truth.
So the researchers publish a paper debunking it. And on the surface, you might think, oh no, this is terrible for the land back movement. They lost their best talking point. But why does the Guardian article argue that debunking this myth actually strengthens the argument for indigenous land rights?
Because relying on shaky, fabricated, or unproven statistics is incredibly dangerous in high-stakes international policy arenas. If your primary argument for receiving billions in climate funding is based on a fake number, your opponents, the mining lobbies, the agricultural conglomerates, they will tear your credibility apart.
Right.
The Guardian piece points out that we simply don't need fabricated numbers to prove the point. The actual, rigorous, peer-reviewed data, like the Mongabay studies, like the fire science, overwhelmingly and undeniably shows that indigenous stewardship yields vastly superior ecological outcomes compared to the alternatives. When advocates rely on accurate data, the argument for indigenous autonomy becomes scientifically bulletproof.
And that scientifically bulletproof argument leads directly to a major, ongoing conflict in global conservation philosophy. The sources contrast modern, indigenous-led stewardship with an older, highly colonial model known as fortress conservation.
Right, fortress conservation is a paradigm that dominated the 20th century, heavily pushed by early Western environmentalists and large conservation NGOs. It is based on a deeply flawed, romanticized idea that true nature must be entirely pristine, untouched, and fundamentally devoid of human presence.
Okay.
To create these pristine parks, colonial governments and conservation organizations forcefully evicted the indigenous peoples who had lived in those landscapes and managed them for millennia.
The mechanics of this are brutal. The documents detail the eviction of the Maasai pastoralists in East Africa. The government, backed by international conservation money, pushed the Maasai off their traditional grazing lands to create massive game parks, like the Serengeti, primarily for foreign tourists and wildlife safaris. We see the exact same thing in Botswana, with the forced, violent eviction of the San peoples from the Central Kalahari Game Reserve.
It is conservation executed through dispossession.
Yeah.
And the ultimate irony The biological failure of fortress conservation is that it ignores the reality that human presence, specifically the active intentional stewardship by indigenous peoples, is often exactly what created and maintained that rich biodiversity in the first place.
Right.
When you remove the Maasai and their grazing practices, the savanna ecosystem fundamentally degrades. When you remove the indigenous fire practitioners from California, the forest burns down.
So what is the modern alternative? How are communities replacing the fortress model?
The modern alternative, which is gaining massive traction globally, is the creation of Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, or IPCAs. These are conservation areas where indigenous governments hold the primary authority and management responsibility.
And my absolute favorite part of this movement is the rise of the Guardian programs. The sources highlight several of these, notably the First Nations Guardian Watchmen in British Columbia, Canada, and the Mimal Rangers in Arnhem Land, Australia. Let's talk about what these guardians actually do.
These programs put indigenous people back on the landscape as the primary, highly trained stewards. They aren't just symbolic guides, they operate almost like an environmental protection agency combined with a Coast Guard. The Guardian Watchmen patrol vast stretches of complex coastal territories by boat. They monitor millions of hectares of land.
Wow.
They conduct rigorous scientific water testing, protect threatened species like bears and salmon from poachers, manage the impact of tourists, and strictly enforce conservation rules based on their own indigenous laws and traditional knowledge systems.
They are the eyes and ears on the ground. They physically prove that human presence, when guided by ancestral responsibility and robust ecological knowledge, isn't a threat to nature, it is a requirement for protecting it. So, if we look at all this, if the peer-reviewed data, the fire science, and the success of the Guardian programs clearly prove that Indigenous autonomy leads to objectively better climate and biodiversity outcomes, why is there such a massive bottleneck in support?
You're hitting on the central frustration of the movement today.
There is a truly shocking statistic in our sources. Despite all the high-level UN speeches praising Indigenous knowledge, it is estimated that only about 17% of global climate funding designated for Indigenous land protection actually reaches the Indigenous communities themselves. Where is the rest of the money going? What is the mechanical disconnect here?
The disconnect is a massive bureaucratic colonial hangover in global finance. Major governments, international climate funds, and large legacy Western NGOs want the ecological benefits of indigenous stewardship. They want the carbon sequestration numbers to hit their Paris Agreement targets, they want the biodiversity metrics, but they are deeply institutionally hesitant to actually hand over direct financial power, legal authority, and political autonomy to indigenous nations.
So they want the results, but they want to keep control of the checkbook.
Precisely. They view indigenous communities as beneficiaries or stakeholders rather than sovereign governments. As a result, the vast majority of that climate funding gets eaten up by a massive intermediary bureaucracy. It goes to highly paid consultants, international NGO headquarters in Geneva or Washington, D.C., and Byzantine government agencies who design complex conservation projects for indigenous peoples rather than directly funding indigenous-led, locally designed priorities.
The bureaucracy starves the front line. And this reluctance to grant true autonomy, this desire to control the territory from afar, leads us directly into the final and perhaps most urgent section of our deep dive. Because just as indigenous peoples are proving their indispensable scientific role in saving the planet, they are facing a terrifying new wave of existential threats.
Yeah.
And these threats aren't just coming from the traditional villains we all know, like oil companies or clear-cut loggers. The new threat is coming from the very industries claiming to save the environment.
We are rapidly entering the era of green extraction. The global transition away from fossil fuels to clean energy, which is necessary to halt climate change, requires massive, unprecedented amounts of critical minerals. We need lithium for batteries, cobalt, copper, nickel for electric vehicles, solar panels, and wind turbines. The problem is geographical. A vast percentage of the world's untapped reserves of these critical minerals are located directly on or adjacent to indigenous territories globally.
It's history repeating itself, just with better PR. A mining company violently taking land for gold in 1850 is now a tech conglomerate taking land for lithium in 2026. The sources heavily document rising violence, intimidation, and assassinations of indigenous land defenders in places like the Andean highlands of Peru and the Atacama Desert in Chile, driven entirely by this new, frantic mining boom for battery minerals.
The economic pressure is immense. In the rush to save the global climate, the fundamental rights of local indigenous communities, specifically their right to free, prior, and informed consent, their right to simply say no to a lithium mine destroying their water table are being systematically steamrolled by states and corporations claiming the moral high ground of the green transition.
And it isn't just physical mining. The sources cover the intense, highly organized resistance at global climate summits, like the lead up to COP30, against what indigenous leaders explicitly call false climate solutions. The biggest battleground here is carbon markets and carbon offsets. We need to explain the mechanics of this because it is insidious.
Carbon offsets are a prime example of how modern, market-based climate policy can rapidly mutate into a new form of colonial extraction. The basic mechanism works like this. A major corporation in the global north, say an airline or an oil company, wants to claim they are carbon neutral, but they don't actually want to stop emitting greenhouse gases.
So they buy a pass.
Exactly. They offset their continued pollution by buying carbon credits. These credits are generated by projects in the global south, often claiming to protect a forest in the Amazon or the Congo basin from being cut down, thereby saving the carbon stored in the trees.
It's like a diet analogy. It's like I pay you to go on a strict diet so I can morally justify eating an entire chocolate cake every day. I'm outsourcing the sacrifice. But how does this specifically harm the indigenous communities living in that forest?
Because the people actually living in that forest, the original stewards, are often completely marginalized by the process. A foreign corporation or a large conservation NGO comes in, negotiates a deal with the national government, and draws a boundary around the forest. Suddenly, the local indigenous community is told that they can no longer practice their traditional sustainable agriculture, they can no longer hunt, they can no longer harvest timber to build homes, because those trees are now legally a financial asset, a carbon sink, owned by a tech company in California.
The forest is financialized? The community is locked out of their own kitchen?
Exactly. Indigenous leaders across the globe are warning that allowing corporations to use indigenous lands as offsets without deep, binding, free, prior, and informed consent is just carbon colonialism. It treats indigenous territory as a global utility, a planetary sponge, designed solely to balance the ledgers of corporate polluters in the north.
And rapid advances in technology are accelerating this commodification. There is a fascinating warning issued by United Nations experts in our sources regarding artificial intelligence. Now, on one hand, AI and satellite tech can be amazing tools. As we saw with the Zurente people, they can use it to predict fires, monitor illegal logging, and track poachers.
But the UN experts warn that technology is a double-edged sword. There is a massive risk of extraction here. Large tech companies and massive conservation groups are increasingly flying drones over indigenous lands, using AI algorithms to hypermap their resources and essentially harvesting their traditional ecological knowledge. If this data is extracted, processed, and monetized without the explicit consent and control of the community, it constitutes a severe threat to indigenous data sovereignty.
They are mapping the resources so they can eventually commodify them. It raises the question, are we just greenwashing the doctrine of discovery? If a corporation can use a satellite to claim ownership of the carbon in your trees, aren't they just planting a high-tech flag?
That is the exact fear expressed by many legal advocates in these sources. If the underlying power dynamic doesn't fundamentally shift, if the state or the corporation still assumes the ultimate unilateral right to decide how the land is used, then the extraction simply continues under a different banner, regardless of whether it's labeled green or sustainable.
But the defense against this new wave of extraction is just as fierce and just as physical as it was in the 1800s. The sources highlight extreme frontline territorial defense. I want to talk about the Munduruku people in the Brazilian Amazon.
The story of the Munduruku demarcation is incredibly intense.
It is. The Brazilian government was endlessly dragging its feet, completely failing in its constitutional duty to formally demarcate the boundaries of the Munduruku's ancestral territory, known as Saramubu. The territory was being rapidly invaded by heavily armed illegal gold miners and illegal loggers, destroying the rivers with mercury. So the Munduruku decided they couldn't wait for the state anymore. They physically mobilized. They organized a massive trek, sending teams of warriors, elders, and leaders to physically walk the vast perimeter of their territory deep in the rainforest.
They took GPS coordinates, they cleared paths, and they physically painted and erected their own official warning signs, essentially doing the work of the federal government themselves.
They are putting their bodies on the line, directly confronting armed cartels to enforce their own borders because the state has abandoned them. And this physical demarcation isn't just about their own survival, it is absolutely vital for protecting the most vulnerable populations on the entire planet, the uncontacted tribes.
The sources detail the desperate, urgent need to formally demarcate lands to protect groups living in voluntary isolation, like the Kalahiva people in Brazil. These are communities that have chosen to avoid contact with the dominant society. Their survival depends entirely on the absolute protection of their forests. If illegal loggers or cattle ranchers penetrate their territory, the uncontacted tribes face not only the threat of violent massacre, but the devastating threat of introduced diseases like the flu or COVID, against which they have zero immunological defense. Demarcating and aggressively defending these buffer zones is a matter of immediate life or death.
And as we look at this concept of territorial defense, we have to expand our definition of what territory actually means. We have to look beyond the land and talk about the water. The sources take us out into the deep ocean. They highlight the work of indigenous leaders like Solomon Pilikahuhalahala, a native Hawaiian elder who is actively pushing to integrate indigenous knowledge and legal frameworks into the United Nations High Seas Treaty.
This represents a massive conceptual leap for international law. For centuries, Western legal frameworks, particularly the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, have treated the high seas, the deep ocean beyond the 200-mile national exclusive economic zones, as a kind of liquid terra nullius. It is viewed legally as an empty, dark void belonging to no one, open for unregulated exploitation, industrial fishing, and the impending threat of deep-sea mining.
But indigenous Pacific leaders like Kahuhalahala forcefully reject that definition. They argue that the oceans are not empty voids. They are highly connected, culturally significant ancestral ecosystems. The deep sea is the origin of life in many creation narratives. They argue that modern marine conservation cannot just be about carving out extraction zones. It must integrate indigenous relationships to ocean places, recognizing the sea itself as a living entity, a relative that requires deep stewardship, not just management.
If we pull all of these threads together, from the deep ocean to the Amazon rainforest to the lithium deposits under the desert, the central undeniable insight from all these sources is that survival depends on a fundamental paradigm shift. We have to move from an extractive mindset, viewing the Earth as a warehouse of resources to be depleted, to a relational mindset. We cannot simply extract our way out of a climate crisis using the exact same logic that caused the crisis in the first place.
Okay, we have covered an immense, challenging amount of ground today. We started by looking at the mechanical, historical, legal fictions, doctrines like discovery and terra nullius, enforced by cases like Johnson v. Emmentosh, and policies like the Dawes Act, that literally severed people from their lands and attempted to erase their complex diplomatic traditions.
We then traced the brilliant multi-generational legal and physical resistance movements that fought back against that structural erasure. We saw how indigenous nations turned the courts into battlegrounds, shattering foundational myths through the Mabo, Bolt, and Delgamusse decisions, and how that legal pressure paved the way for the modern land back movement, securing actual physical real estate today.
And we arrived at the undeniable, peer-reviewed, scientifically backed reality that indigenous stewardship through practices like cultural burning and the expansion of guardian watchman programs is our absolute best hope for maintaining a stable climate and a thriving biosphere, even as new existential threats like green extraction and carbon colonialism emerge.
And we must constantly remember that none of this is just an abstract history lesson.
No, it absolutely is not. To you, the listener, this history is not trapped in the past. It is actively playing out right now in the air you breathe, the climate policies your local and federal governments enact, the source of the critical minerals powering the smartphone battery in your hand, and the financial structures of the public institutions around you. The decisions made about indigenous land sovereignty today, in this decade, will definitively dictate the habitability of the planet you live on tomorrow.
It is, without question, the defining intersection of environmental survival and human rights of our time.
Before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final mind-bending concept. It's drawn directly from our sources, but I want you to push the logic of it just a step further into your own life. In 2014, the government of New Zealand passed a revolutionary, paradigm-shattering piece of legislation called the Tirera Act. This act did something entirely unprecedented in Western law. It removed a massive, ancient rainforest from the national park system entirely. It didn't just give the land back, it granted the forest itself its own legal personhood. The forest, Tirera, legally owns itself. It has all the rights, powers, duties, and liabilities of a legal person, and it is represented and managed in court and in practice by the Tuho people, who have a profound ancestral relationship with it.
It fundamentally and elegantly dismantles the Western concept of property.
Exactly. It breaks the game board. So I want you to think about the park down your street. Think about the river that runs through the center of your city or the mountain range on your horizon. What would happen if we stopped asking who owns nature and started treating nature as a legal person with its own inherent rights to exist and thrive? If the land itself could sue for its protection, and if its oldest original stewards were legally recognized as its voice, how would our world change tomorrow?
Keep questioning the architecture of the world around you.
Thanks for diving deep with us. Keep asking questions, and we'll see you next time.